Hi.
Today is February 18th, 2024, and we are here to interview Bob Simons, who after 52 years is stepping down from the Alachua Audubon Board. And so we are excited to hear about the early history of the Audubon Board and the projects that you worked on, and sharing some of your wisdom with us.
Okay, well,
I'm going to turn it over to you, Bob.
two things that I'm really bad at is history and remembering people's names, so you might take all this with a grain of salt. I came back, I'm a veteran from Vietnam. I came back from Vietnam and went 1 year up to NC State. I was working on a PhD degree, and then I came back here, and so it's not clear to me exactly which year I joined, but I'm going to say 1972. It might have been 71, but I was definitely working on Audubon projects in 1972. Helen Hood was president, I think, in maybe 71 or 72. Marjorie Carr had been president right before that. Joe Little was president in that time period, just after that. And John Hintermister, obviously, he was there. And lots of other people that, again, Griselda Forbes is one of the long time. She's still alive, I think. And that's somebody else you could interview or ask about what the early years were like. Yeah, I'm trying to think of people's names, but anyway, and Barbara Muschwitz was another one who was there early on. So I was mostly interested. Well, the reason I joined was I wanted to learn to ID the birds, learn about the birds. So I wanted to go on field trips. It was field trips that drew me in to want to be an Audubon board member, just so I could go out with people like John Hintermister on a field trip and he could educate me. Erica and I had been learning about other things. We had set up 7 freshwater fish tanks, and we were learning all the local freshwater fish, and learning to identify them. And I knew the trees, and Erica and I together went on Dana Griffin's wildflower walks and so on. So we were just trying to learn about nature. But as soon as I joined, I found out, well, they have projects. They had just been donated the land for Coakley Hill Sanctuary. So that was a project. We wanted to fence that and put gates and put signs and mow trails and manage that sanctuary. So I became the sanctuary chairman early on because nobody else wanted to mess with it. And then I got on the conservation committee. Well, Helen Hood and Marjorie Carr and various other people had been working with the state to set up the state's land buying programs. The first one of which was the Environmentally Endangered Lands Program. So they had, and Florida Audubon and Sierra Club and various people had lobbied to change the state laws to enable Florida to buy large pieces of land for conservation. It was a big deal. And so that legislation got passed in 73 or 74. And Helen wanted to know, well, what here in Alachua County? They had already bought Paynes Prairie. That was done around 1970, 69 and 70 and 71, I think. But other than that, I mean, we had Olino State Park, but there weren't that many state parks around. But so Helen and I and Archie Carr and various other people, Dan Ward, said, well, San Flasco Hammock ought to be bought, you know, we ought to work on that. So I had been to forestry school. I knew how to put together a proposal. You know, I went down to the county and I figured out who owned what. You know, there were 10 major owners in San Flasco Hammock. So I found out what they owned and mapped it, you know, made a map. And everybody had wanted to buy a little piece of San Flasco Hammock. But I thought, you know, bigger's better. You ought to buy the whole thing. If it's too small, it's just going to get swamped by outside forces like invasive exotic plants and whatever. That still might destroy it eventually, but bigger's better. You can defend it better, and it'll support more species. And so we worked on, Helen Hood and I primarily together worked with help from lots of other people, including Archie Carr. All of these projects that I've worked on involve lots of people cooperating together to accomplish something. It's really hard for one person to do something all by themselves unless they recruit other people and they become the leader of a group of people. So anyway, it took 2 years. I mean, Helen Hood and I both spent probably 40 hours a week for 2 years, every week, getting San Flasco Hammock bought. But we did. We accomplished it. So that was an Alachua Audubon project. So that's probably one of our biggest projects ever, was accomplishing that. And it was a battle all the way through. And I remember at the end, in 1974, when it passed all the hoops and it was proposed, the governor and cabinet would have to vote on each project that was proposed in the Environmentally Endangered Lands Program. So Helen was gone somewhere. She might have been in Australia or I don't know where. Anyway, I was the only one that went to the governor and cabinet meeting. And I got up there and immediately got blindsided by a couple of things. One was the owner of a square mile, 640 acres. It was a pair of University of Florida professors wanted to withdraw. They had agreed to sell. They already had a contract. The state had a contract with them where they had agreed to sell, but they wanted to pull out. They realized, well, if we don't sell, we could sell it for a lot more money in a couple of years, you know. But so I had to get up and speak against that, and you know, I don't know who it was a governor or a cabinet member, said, well, is this really critical for the project? And I had to answer to that. So I said yes, basically, and explained why. And that was the whole Blues Creek ecosystem part of San Flasco Hammock. Really, it was critical. So they kept that in. The other thing, which was even worse, was that they had a really horrible Department of Natural Resources director who pulled, you know, said one of the projects didn't qualify because a real estate agent related to somebody or whatever. So there was 1,000 and something acres that went right up in the middle of it that he pulled out of the project. So that was disappointing. But anyway, they voted that they bought it. And I got one of the little side notes was that one of my neighbors that was over there, Mr. McMullen, worked for Doyle Connor, Department of Agriculture. He's a good friend of Doyle Connor. He got Doyle Connor to vote for San Francisco Hammock. Doyle Connor didn't vote for any of the other purchases, but he voted for that one.
Well, it's interesting that you were actually able to get all those landowners, the 10
Oh, it did make sense. Yeah,
landowners, to be willing to sell to
yeah,
the state.
it's miraculous.
Yeah.
I did some praying on it. I don't know if we had divine intervention or not, but that was surprising to me because it wasn't to any of their financial advantage
Did
to
any of
sell.
them have homes on the property, or it was just they owned the property?
Yeah. And I'm sure they all knew that. But there was a lot of pressure, political, social pressure for them to sell it. The county commission was all in favor of it. I'm trying to think of the name of all of the conservation organizations like the Garden Club and so on were in favor of it. The Chamber of Commerce was unanimously in favor. That's the one I thought was surprising to me. And so anyway, it got bought. There was this big piece that didn't get bought, which everybody else kind of quit advocating, so I ended up being the main advocate for that. And it got bought. 800 acres out of 1,200 got bought. The part that didn't get bought ended up being the Hammock 1 and Hammock 2 subdivisions.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, that thing that went all the way up in the middle, most of that got bought, so it didn't go all the way up in the middle anymore. Yeah. So anyway, that was a big accomplishment early on in 72, 3, 4. It got bought in 74.
Do you recall how many acres was purchased for San Velasco?
It was 6,000 and some.
About-
Right now it's 7,000.
So it was over 6,000.
Yeah, because they've added a few pieces.
Wow.
So then there were a number of other. Well, first of all, there were additional programs. There was P2000 and all these other programs. They kept putting money into the pot to buy lands, and so I advocated along with other people for various of these. One was the McLeod Ranch, which was added to Olino as River Rise State Preserve. We advocated for that. We advocated for Tosahatchee, east of Orlando. We advocated for the Fakahatchee Strand and various other things around the state. And it wasn't all hard work. I got to go visit these places and stay. I stayed for a week at Tosahatchee in a little cabin off in the wilderness all by myself. It was a lot of fun. But it was also a good thing to do.
That's interesting that Alachua Audubon was involved in projects throughout the state.
Okay, and now the lines started to get blurry because
Or were you
I got
acting as a
with-
consultant or a...
our Marjorie Carr left Alachua Audubon and formed FDE, Florida Defenders of the Environment. So a lot of the things that I did, they'd say, well, who do you represent? Well, a lot of times I said FDE because I joined FDE. So it's a little blurry as to whether some of this is mostly FDE or mostly Audubon, but San Velasco Hammock was definitely Alachua Audubon. And so was Riverwise. Some of these others, like Fakahatchee, that might have been mostly FDE.
Mhm.
And then there was the question of who gets to manage these and how do they manage them? And I'd been to forestry school and I was a land manager. So I got to weigh in on how to manage all these places. And one of the big issues that came up, it's separate, well, it was a combination. I mean, Tosahatchee was similar, but the Forest Service throughout the entire country did a big rethink of how they managed the national forest of the United States in the 80s, 1980s. They came up with a 5-year plan, but they put a lot of planning effort into it. And I weighed in on that. And they had been doing pretty well, actually. They knew how to prescribe burn, which most of these other people weren't all that good at it or comfortable with it. But they had not done any growing season burning. It was all winter burning. So a number of people, myself included, advocated that they start doing growing season burning. And on the Ocala National Forest, this is divided into 2 ranger districts. There was a man named Jerry Klutz, who was the ranger in charge of the Lake George district, of the northern half of Ocala National Forest. And he was a really good man, conscientious. And he said, well, you know what? I'm gonna give it a try. So he did 5 or 6 big summer burns and loved it. The results were great. So that got him started doing that. And you know, we had a hand in that. Alachua Audubon and FDE together. So that was changing policy countrywide, really,
Mhm.
that we had an impact on. I became a member of the Exotic Pest Council or whatever that thing was that Karen used to do the newsletter.
Florida Exotic Pest Plant
Yeah.
Council, yeah.
So I had some input into that. That's a management issue. So I got, when they found out that I was willing for free to give management advice, I got on the Swanee River Waters Management District advisory board for managing their lands, and I got on the Best Management Practices Committee for Forestry for Florida, and all sorts of things like that. We got to go to all these meetings. And one of the things, a purchase that I worked on, helped to work on, was in association with Judy Hancock. I don't know if you guys know of her,
Mhm.
but she lived in Lake City, and she was the Florida Sierra Club chair for something, conservation, I think, maybe. She was a tiny little woman, but strong. We'd go to these, she and I, for instance, were on this forestry forum that the forest industry created to kind of counterbalance mostly the Sierra Club. The Sierra Club wanted to do away with all sorts of things that the Forest Service did. clear cutting was their one other main objective. They wanted to do away with that. So they had this Florida Forest Forum to air some of these issues. And there's these great big burly forest managers and industry types, and they actually tried to bully Judy Hancock in some of these meetings. Didn't turn out well. She was tougher than all of them put together. But anyway, that was something we hashed out. For instance, wetlands, rules for clear cutting wetlands and rules for just best management practices for forestry. And I ended up on the Division of Forestry's BMP advisory committee. So there's just one thing after another. And yeah. So that's kind of early on, up through the 1980s. The Forest Service shift was around 1985 is when they started doing prescribed burning in the summertime, growing season burning.
So why were they resistant? I mean, that's when we have the most rain, so
Well, it's safer and easier to burn in the wintertime. They're less likely. The Forest Service, up to that point, they were a multiple use agency, but they were focused on timber production. And out west also grazing. Not so much ecology or endangered species or that sort of thing. But they realized in around 1980 that they needed to update, they needed to change. They needed to pay more attention to recreation and ecology and endangered species and that sort of thing. So they put a big effort into redoing their management thinking. And so burning in the wintertime is good, but burning in the growing season, if you're trying to manage something like longleaf pine, wiregrass, sandhills, is much better. It kills out the invading hardwoods like laurel, oak, and sweet gum and cherry and so on. Much better if you burn after they leafed out. That'll kill them back much better. And wiregrass likes to be burned in the growing season. It responds better. And the whole system was basically adapted to growing season burning. I mean, that's when lightning strikes occur and so on. So does that answer that question pretty much?
yeah.
Yeah, okay. So it was a good thing. One of the things that had changed that I kind of liked the oak domes that occur in the sandhills in the Ocala National Forest, which are clones of sand live oak. They're all identical and they form this dome of little sand live oaks that are all crooked and whatever. Well, that's an artifact of them burning in the wintertime all the time. As soon as they switched over to growing season burning, that wiped those out. They didn't belong there, but they were really cool. So, yeah. You have to go with the whole package. So, what else you want to know about Latch Audubon?
I'd like to know how and when you started the Kestrel project and what prompted you to do that.
It, well, somehow or another I met John Smallwood,
Mm-hmm.
and he had, well, before that, Susan Cerulean had been on Latch Audubon board. She was Susan Mashburn when she was on the board. But she liked cerulean warblers, so she changed her name. So, and moved to Tallahassee. She became the non-game wildlife person for the state, for the game commission. And so we had already talked about this when she was here in Gainesville, but I wanted something to be done to help kestrels. The breeding population here in Florida was declining, and it looked bad. So she wrote up a proposed program and got it funded to study kestrels, and John Smallwood got the grant to do it, and he was here at the University of Florida. So he designed excellent kestrel boxes, and his plan was to put 300 kestrel boxes up in Marion County and Levy County and Alachua County and nearby Putnam County maybe. And because his thought was that one of the main issues for kestrels was their cavity nesters was not enough cavities. So he was going to build these little boxes to provide the cavities and then put them in appropriate habitat. So he did. And the first 13 boxes that he put up, I helped him put them up. We did it together. And so I learned from him how to make the boxes, how to put them up, what kind of habitat, where to put them up, all that. And some of the things to look out for. And that was 1982 is when we put those up. No, 1992, excuse me, 1996. I would have got graded off on that on my history, by my history kit. 92. So his results were pretty spectacular. The populations of kestrels increased, and he had gotten permission to put the boxes on utility poles, so all I had to do was drive down the various roads, put them on the utility poles, and then monitor. And so it was working great, but he learned all sorts of things. Like what's the main cause of mortality for baby kestrels in boxes 16 feet up above the ground on a utility pole? What's the main threat?
Snakes or fire ants?
Fire ants. Yeah. So we use Amdro, and we locate nests and put Amdro around the nest, and we put Amdro around the pole. So that helped. And a guy named Richard Melvin figured out a way to put Amdro in a little wire cage in the box itself underneath the liver, and that also helped. But anyway, so then I thought, well, I can make those boxes and put them up too, so I started doing that. And then there was a guy named Bruce Christensen on the board. Oh, that's Audubon. I decided that I wanted it to be an Audubon, Natural Audubon project, so that I had a little bit of political cover for what I was doing. And I could say, well, this is an Audubon project that might get me on a private landowner's property quicker than just saying, well, I'm a crazy veteran with nothing better to do. So anyway, so I presented it to the board. Well, he was on the board. He said, I'm all in favor of that, but I think we could make a lot more boxes. I could get a Boy Scout troop to make the boxes. And so we did, and made 100 boxes, which was a lot more than I was ready to put up.
How many?
But anyway,
100.
100?
that was not 2006 that we started. That's when we made those 100 boxes. And I had to kind of finish the boxes. They put them together with little wire brads that they shot in with some kind of gun, and that wasn't